Good morning and welcome. I'm Damian Wetzel, Director of the Aspen Institute's Arts Programs. Thank you for joining us for this latest session in our Identity and Culture track. We are turning today now to the role of museums in society and how they represent our identity or don't in this day and age, and what we're doing about it. In a sense, I'm just coming from a session some of you may have been at on the humanities and university life, and there's a certain clubbiness that comes into this conversation, and how is that club being expanded, whether it's in the membership, the viewership as it were, the staffing, the representative artworks, and what the overall goals are. So I'm going to turn this over to our moderator today, my colleague Kate Levin, who as Commissioner for Cultural Affairs in New York City for 12 years under Mayor Bloomberg transformed the city in myriad ways, which I as an artist benefited from. She will be introducing this incredibly distinguished panel, which I'm so grateful for all of them for joining us. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you, Damian. Good morning, everyone. Again, extraordinary panel. We have Thelma Golden, director of the Studio Museum in Harlem, Teresita Fernández, one of the major U.S. artists, and Michael Govan, who runs LACMA, the Los Angeles County Museum, who also flew here himself as a sign of commitment to the cause. So what we're here to discuss, as Damian said, is the issue of diversity, particularly in museums. And by way of context, museums live in interesting and challenging times these days. Lots of operational shifts, lots of challenges in adapting to new kinds of technology, lots of ways of changing not only the fundamental exhibitry in museums, but what patrons have come to expect in buildings themselves, and lots of opportunities to try and seize to inform and comment on fundamental social issues. These institutions tend to be anchors in their communities. They take up more real estate than any other category of cultural institution in the United States. And they are generally rising to these various occasions, except in one major area they struggle with this issue of diversity. A lot of recent research by a number of very distinguished academics and practitioners, Adriana Zavala, Michael Kaiser, Zanny Voss, among others, have pointed to persistent differences between mainstream and culturally specific organizations. And two major studies have really, I think, informed a lot of thinking and created a greater sense of urgency of late. The Mellon Foundation did a survey of the AAMD, which is the Association of Art Museum Directors of North America, in the past 2 years. And what they found is that in the aggregate, these institutions, and this includes Canada, the United States, and Mexico, employees are 72% white and 28% minority. Even more seriously, in the leadership categories, curators, conservators, educators, and senior administrators at these museums, these institutions are 84% white. 6% Asian, 4% Black, 3% Hispanic. In most of these institutions, the vast majority of people of color are in the security and maintenance functions in these institutions. A semi-bright note in the area of gender, roughly 50-50 in terms of leadership, although women tend to have leadership roles at institutions with smaller annual operating budgets. And 91% of board members at museums are white. The New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, under my terrific successor, Tom Finkelpearl, also did a survey of New York City institutions. There, the findings are that 74% of senior staff are white, and among board members, 78% are white. Neither of these studies, by the way, addressed sexual orientation or disability because those remain protected topics under federal law. So how do these statistics match up with the most recent US Census findings? Currently, the United States is 30% people of color, and that's projected to be 50% by the year 2042. So what's standing in the way of diversity at museums? Is it the preconception that diversity is somehow a burden or a deficit? that it's an obligation, not a positive, that it's a choice between the best candidate and the diverse candidate, that there's no pipeline. These are all the kinds of issues that many of us who've participated in conversations and efforts to try and create some meaningful change here have heard over the year. The consensus is clear. This is an urgent problem, that it requires action. But what are the key interventions? How should we move as a group of interested individuals to affect the necessary paradigm shifts in U.S. museums? So it's what we're going to try and make some progress on as a group today. And I want to start with Thelma, not only because she's sitting immediately to my left, but you have said when we were talking about this in the run-up to this conversation that your institution was essentially created as a diversity initiative. Talk a little bit about how you see the issues and you see potential positive ways forward.
Well, in 1968, when the Studio Museum was founded, the statistics you just read were somewhat similar. I mean, they were worse, but that is to say, in 47 years, they haven't got much better. So the museum's premise in 1968 was that in a museum world that did not show in any significant way African-American artists, that there were not opportunities for African-American administrators, curators, directors, registrars, development people, that the Studio Museum in its founding in Harlem could not only be an institution to collect and preserve the work of African-American artists, but also to advocate for diversity within the larger museum world. Fast forward to the time I came to the Studio Museum in 2000, after spending over a decade at the Whitney, the actuality for curators, and I'll speak of curators because I am a curator, was not very different than it had been in 1968. I was the first African-American curator at the Whitney. I came to work at the Studio Museum in 2000 for Lowry Stokes Sims, who became director of the Studio Museum. Lowry had been the first African-American curator at the Metropolitan Museum. She was hired at the Met in '74. I was hired at the Whitney in 1990. In between that moment, not very much had happened, sort of nationwide. So then the two of us came to the Studio Museum, kind of changing, of course, that demographic very quickly, but with a commitment towards our work, not only continuing to run what had been this esteemed institution, which really had changed the art world and putting many Black artists out there into the art museum world, but that we would take a very focused look at what it meant to impact the diversity of the staff of institutions by very distinctly and directly creating a pathway towards opportunity, training, and mentorship of young people of color to move into the field. So the path forward, I think, is that itself, right? Acknowledging that in, almost a half century, when we look across the country, there has not been significant change, right, in these numbers. The statistics, I think we all knew what they would be, but seeing them in writing, of course, was really a wake-up call to imagine that the commitment to this on the part of museums, senior staff, boards, and the community at large has to now be one that is full and clear and not only the work of culturally specific institutions.
Thank you. So, Teresita, one of the things you said in the run-up to this conversation was that you were the person with the least power on this panel. Although, ideally,
No.
I was going to say,
Long run, exactly.
I said institutional.
For today.
although everybody here, but it's an interesting thing. Everybody's
Yeah.
here on behalf of artists, and yet artists often feel like they have the least ability to create change. How do these issues of diversity impact you as an artist?
I'd first like to say that, what we were talking about before was that I am the person with the least institutional power on this panel, but I do see myself as a thought leader, and I do think that there's an important responsibility to inspire, preferably through my work, but also through the things that I say and put out there, and I do think that artists are very powerful in that context, and that sometimes museums have become so corporate that they forget that artists are that backbone of why we have museums in the first place. And so I think it's important to bring artists back into that conversation. Not because we have to be nice and share, right? Those aren't the real reasons to do it, or because they'll make us feel better, but because they'll make better museums. Now, I'm an artist, so, I'm an artist, so my tools, my currency is my imagination, people's imagination, beauty. Beauty. People underestimate beauty. Beauty is a very powerful thing. Images are very powerful. This is what we do as artists. This is how we change people's minds, right? And so I am sort of in the business of perception. I'm in the work of perception. This is what I do. And so what I think I think that artists can give a lot of important information about how what needs to change is the perception of why this is important. Now, when we talk about diversity in other ways, we have no problem understanding why it's really healthy and good for all of us, right? And so I believe that culture is shared. I believe that we're implied in one another's success institutionally and every other way in the art world. But there seems to be this mental block about how we perceive this issue of diversity in museums. When we think of the same idea in science, when we think of biodiversity, we have no problem whatsoever understanding why this is a really good thing. Not only why it's really good, but why it's important to survival. When we talk about diversity in our investment portfolios, we have no problem at all understanding why it is a really smart thing to do, right? And that, in fact, our survival depends on it. And so the perception that I'd like to shift is going from this sort of like handout mentality where people in positions of power feel like they want to do something good and help people of color or marginalized people and bring them in as a guest, which can sometimes feel very condescending, especially if you're an artist who has created a career based on ideas and hard work and rigorous work. And shifting that to instead understand that the reciprocity is essential and that we actually have something really important to bring to one another, right? And that the idea of American art and how museums tell the story of American art is infinitely more interesting when we expand and amplify our notions of what American artists are, who they are, and the narratives that they're telling. And that makes us all more interesting. It means that if we embrace that, we understand that museums will be then socially and economically viable too, because they cannot sustain themselves with these shifting audiences. We know that in 25 years, the audiences will be completely different, which also means that the people on these boards will be completely different and that they need to be cultivated to feel like museums are part of them as well, and that they are an important part of that story, not a guest.
So, Michael, you said that in the pretty recent past, you didn't necessarily get a lot of flack for not doing anything about this issue. Your sense is that not only, under your leadership, that you've been working at this for a while, but your location in Los Angeles was particularly important. As LA goes, so goes the rest of the United States in terms of some of these issues, but also that Hollywood and Silicon Valley are finally getting to focus on this. How does that make a pathway forward for your institution, your leadership, your priorities?
Well, I think the choice to move to LA was partly this idea that it was younger and less formed, and the world has changed so dramatically. And so it was there that there was a possibility of reinvention. And everything Teresita's saying is true. It's also true that museums have been just utterly, we know it's important, and yet museums have been utterly slow in institutions generally. And so the question is why and how would you deal with that? I mean, part of it is that institutions are meant to bridge lives and keep consistency over long periods of time, so necessarily they change slowly. I always think when I got to LA, I was like, well, if we're going to do anything significant, it'll be a quarter century, not a quarter as a business would think about, because it takes time. On the other hand, there's this, I think, false sense that institutions are fixed, and that is a strength. when if you think about art and artists, I mean, artists have been around for tens of thousands of years and institutions for like a couple hundred years. And really, the institution that I run is an idea of the late 19th century, or you could even call it an artifact of the late 19th century, of a particular way of looking at the idea of library and bringing the exotic things together for a locality. And so because we change slowly, we find ourselves in this completely different world, and yet, you know, we haven't exactly evolved as quickly as that world. So I think it's been nice because Los Angeles has been a great place in a great time to take advantage of what I think is the opening of the doors and windows for an invigorating breath of fresh air in this conversation to have something exciting to say for the future. So my board's been super supportive of every initiative to diversify staff, programs, and audience, and it's been at a pretty good clip, but not fast enough for my taste, and I think a long way to go, because still, it still feels like the whole infrastructure is built on a different set of values, which is not the value of that you would see in business of always looking for the new, always looking for the new point of view. And I'm not just saying new art as an investment. I'm thinking of the new points of view, looking forward at the demographic and trying to be ahead of that curve, because it takes a long time to build collections, for example, that will respond to that demographic. It could take you 20 years to build a collection that will respond to it's more than 50-50 Hispanic in LA already. So actually, I think that, you know, we are in a bit of a straitjacket sometimes of just the age of the idea of some of these institutions. Even the whole idea of, I run what's called a encyclopedic museum. So that the idea is you have an encyclopedia, you fill in everything. It's so funny how that encyclopedia keeps changing over time. And generally more inclusive. How recently was it that the Metropolitan Museum added African art or contemporary art or things like that? And so there's this sense of inclusivity, and I would say we should just throw out that definition. And I like to think of these general museums as sort of anything goes. Like open, not just to work from different places and different points of view, but different media. Look at how our world is changing in that way in terms of art that's made in different media. So I actually have to say I think it's an incredibly exciting time because of this conversation being held and because boards like mine are so open to it. It's just so exciting to see what we can do.
So one of the sort of more insidious arguments I hear a lot is that museums are one part of an ecology that includes the art market and galleries and other kinds of institutions that are fundamental to determining what we value in art, and that depending on what we value, that determines what makes its way to the authenticating place in a museum. So can you talk a little bit about what you see as the role of the market, the role of galleries? Is there a fundamental issue of determining taste here? I mean, one thing, for example, is that there's been a lot of conversation of late about the increase in interest and value in the Latin American art market, but that doesn't address the issue of U.S. Latino artists. But love to hear from each of you. What's the deal with the market?
Well, I think where we see the impact of the market is on program. And I think if we're going to talk about this diversity issue across many parts of the institution, program is where we've seen the most change, I would say, in the last half century. And some of that has to do with the fact that there's a way in which artists have existed both in the institutional structure and in the market in ways that there's been great growth. Certainly not enough, but the market and taste have embraced a wider, much wider group of artists in ways that I think we can feel in our collections, in programs, in institutions. It is not matched, however, right, in sort of staff and board, and often in institutional structure. But I know Teresita thinks a lot about this in terms of this issue of the market.
Because it is something that I feel, I mean, in many ways I'm privileged, right? Because I do have a market around my work, and it's part of the reason why I can be here and have this conversation. But I am not marketed as a Latino artist. I'm marketed just as an artist who makes conceptual art. And so those liminal spaces allow me to have what is perceived as a successful career. There is, however, though, no context for me, right? There's no context to tell the story. And by the way, this is the reason why this is interesting is because it's a quintessentially American experience, right? So when you talk about Latinos, first, second, third generation, when you talk about the idea of immigration, this is a quintessentially American idea. Mark Rothko was an immigrant. These are not new ideas. Our museums are full of people that we think of as American artists who are immigrants. And so it's important to expand that. But the market has pretty much been created around Latin American art. There was a time where there wasn't a market around Latin American art, when Patty Cisneros in the 80s started to buy a lot of Latin American art from artist studios for very little money. And really creating relationships, establishing relationships with artists that nobody was paying attention to. When she sort of made that interesting and cool and desirable, everyone started to follow. And the auction houses then created Latin American departments, and all of a sudden there was a market built around it because pretty much one person saw the value in it. Now, as an artist as a Latino artist, I do not fit into the Latin American context. I do not get invited into Latin American shows, Latin American biennials. I also am often excluded from the American context because people will read my name and they assume that I must be something else. And so you're always sort of not enough of anything. And I would also add for many Afro-Latinos, because we're used to saying Black and Latino or Black and Hispanic, for mixed race Latinos or Afro-Latinos, of which there are many, 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 they are excluded from the African American context, the white American context, and the Latin American context. So it's like this triple exclusion. And all of these layers of invisibility can be peeled back, right? I believe in sort of basic question asking. Like, if I were on the board of a museum, the first thing that I'd want to do is self-assess, right? Because that's how you learn. Or director of a museum. I'd ask myself, how many shows by a Latino artist have I done in my entire history of my institution? This is the largest and fastest demographic. So not Latin American, not from Mexico, not from Brazil, US-born Latinos who have, we can't even usually name 2 or 3 of them, right? It's actually very difficult, and the default is always a Latin American name that and part of it, by the way, has to do with how the language has been used to manipulate what each group is called. So when you say Hispanic, right, it just means that you speak Spanish. It means that an American museum can raise a bunch of money to do a show of a Latin American artist and call it Hispanic. And it sort of looks like they're doing a show about this demographic in the United States, but they're not. It's actually, they're not parallel tracks. They're actually very different experiences that need to be addressed separately and differently, and there is some overlap, but we basically need to start to complicate these narratives, which are not, this is not a monolithic group. It's different than what we think of as Latin American. And the market is really, really important, because creating a market around something is what allows you that privilege to say something about it. And so artists make a lot of money. We are part of this economy as well. Artists who are doing well are doing really well, and so I think there has to be no shame attached to that. I think that is not a conflict. I actually think that it's an opportunity to use that space that you've created to be a participant in the whole economy, and the economy means also affecting, the decisions that get made and why they get made.
And lest anyone think that this is not something that has direct impact on audiences, interesting. The New York Botanic Garden did a terrific show about Frida Kahlo last year, and for the first time put all their labels in English and in Spanish, and saw a huge increase in attendance, which has persisted to the point that they're going to continue to do the dual language labeling, because it's ultimately about what makes people feel welcome in an institutional context.
The United States is now Mexico is the country in the world that speaks most Spanish. The United States is second. It's not Spain. It's not anywhere in South America, it's the United States.
And I think that, really what this comes to, and your example of the Botanic Garden was really important, because these kinds of decisions are incredibly complex and nuanced. And they can only happen when there are people sitting around the table to discuss and make these decisions. And this is really where, when people say, what would be the biggest lever of change in this? It is leadership in institutions that then can create the environment in terms of staff and board where you can have the kind of conversation that would say that at the New York Botanic Garden, yes, we should have bilingual labels on an exhibition of Frida Kahlo, not only because it'll expand audiences, but because it allows us as an institution to speak more directly to the reality and our aspiration as an institution to reach audiences in ways that are rigorous and important and profound.
So Michael, tell us your experience around the market, but also just to go back to a comment you said that your board was very supportive, because it's one of the things I've also heard a lot is it's hard to move boards. They're generally not particularly diverse. It's not something that they feel comfortable making change around. Boards, market forces for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is important to create markets for artists so they can continue to work and to continue to speak, like as you're saying, Teresita. Although the market can't over-dominate. In the sense, I always explain, market history, art history, they crisscross occasionally. But they're very different things. Making your decisions based on that is a silly. By the way, history is always changing too. But basing your decisions on that doesn't make sense. And in a way, working for a museum, we can be a counterforce to markets, and I do think of us that way sometimes, because if artists are have a voice in some other way, museums can be more activist in seeking to look at other kinds of artists or artists that don't have that voice. But I have to say that this whole idea, there are a lot of excuses made for the slowness of change. One would be, the market forces and what's popular and what's there in audiences. That's just not true. I mean, we're probably the largest trading partner with Mexico in terms of art, culture, and have done a lot of shows of LA-based Latino artists, and it's proved very popular. Our attendance has doubled. Those audiences are growing. They're not what we want them to be, but they've been on a steady rise. And then the other excuse is, well, my board wants to see something else. And I was like, last I checked, didn't you run that institution? Isn't that your job to make those decisions? Shouldn't you be making the decisions on hiring and on programming? And isn't it the curators that make those decisions? And so I think we've misplaced, it becomes a little bit of an excuse. A director or somebody in charge who waits till the environment is accommodating to make that seem normal is not doing their job, when your job is to be ahead of the curve and to see these changes and to realize it's going to take a long time and you have to move quickly. So, and it's just great to have a board that thinks that way, and then of course you have to work to change. The statistics are astounding. It's ridiculous how few programming decision makers in American art museums are non-white. I mean, at LACMA's better. We're less than half, I think, white. But at most places, those statistics, and we actually, this Mellon program that's talked about with the Mellon Foundation to try to create pipelines. And a lot of these programs in the past have been taster programs for young people to try to entice them into museums. But then you realize the whole museum structure is not accommodating. There are no role models. So it takes more work. And we figured out that if we did it the opposite way, which is a more elitist program, which is take a lot of people, narrow them down, and follow. If you put 2 Latino curators in positions of power in the United States, you would double the number. So we changed our minds entirely, that we have to you just have to make impact, create results, and since it takes a while, make those decisions. And I think that all boards just should be supportive of that's why they hire smart curators to make those decisions.
So what are some of the programs, initiatives that you see as promising that should be expanded or that don't yet exist but should be called into being? Thelma?
Well, I think the Mellon program is one that...
It's an experiment, but it's a good one.
Does everybody know about it? Do you want to...
It's basically, so this was a specific program. Obviously any amount of money is like water on a hot rock in this case, because there's so much to do and what can you spend. But the idea was to work with, Mellon Foundation came to us to try to find a network of large museums in cities with big universities and work with the relationship between the museum and the university and start with freshmen, undergraduates in art history and to try to move them through into careers in museums. And so we put this 5 museums together. We have internship programs over the summer. We just did one to introduce those students. And then you learn a lot about what is the case. One side of it is, why wouldn't somebody go to into museums? Because their parents or their friends tell them it's not a good job, there's no good pension, you don't make enough money, it's not a real job. So you have to counter that force. Then there are people whose parents will say, you work for a museum, you're working for essentially a white bastion of conservatism, how could you sell out? There's these 2 perspectives somehow of why kids don't necessarily make the decision to go into this field. So the idea is to spend enough time inside the museum working with these big institutions and universities to make it really clear what the opportunities are and that they are agents, that museums can be agents of change and there is a place for you. So that program, I think it's in place for 3 years. And one of the great things is that the Mellon Foundation board agreed that they would not check results for like 10 years in a very serious way, that they would monitor the programs, but they wouldn't expect with this new strategy immediate results, which is a really important thing because everyone wants to feel good right away that you're doing something in this part of the world. But the truth is you just have to change the numbers. And changing the numbers of like those major positions takes real serious work.
So that's one. I think that many of our institutions also have Mellon Fellowships. At the Studio Museum, that's been the direct way for us to bring in young people coming out of master's or undergraduate programs in art history, spending some time at the Studio Museum, and then very directly through my work sort of advocating for them in positions in other institutions. And we've been able to place curators in institutions around the country. So much so now that we can almost make a web around that in terms of the numbers of curators who've come through our various programs. Another program that is sort of also operating now is with the AAMD, which is working with the UNCF, with the historically black colleges and universities, to also address this issue of just opening up museum careers. And that program has focused on curatorial, but on the whole range of museum careers. So we just had a group of the UNCF interns at our AMD meeting, and some of them are in finance, some of them are looking at careers on the administrative side, and we're looking in that program at creating direct paths for them into that kind of work. But really now, when we're talking about the field and the various programs, there are many, and the key, as Michael said, is that many of them need time to sort of play out. Curatorial careers are long. I mean, it doesn't happen after a 2-year program. And so
And just intervene for a minute, it was interesting, the conversation that some of us were just at with Drew Faustin was all about how basically knowledge takes time. And it's worth remembering.
Exactly.
Go ahead, I'm
sorry. So that we're also looking at that as the timeline. I think the other thing that's been happening that's less a program and more informal is the way in which leadership in the museum field across different kinds of institutions, encyclopedic institutions, local regional institutions, culturally specific institutions, are really looking now backwards at best practices and trying to replicate at scale. Because the truth of it is, a lot of this can happen one by one in an institution and be successful. What we know now is we need scale, and that's happening at a board level. There's been a kind of national conversation happening among some board members and then among museum leadership to see how we can take what we already have and how we can scale it. Because I think what we all know is that they're really on the part of the leadership. And I will say that we're at a point now among museum leadership where this is a conversation everyone's willing to have, but we all know we need to actually make change happen. Recent history has shown us, right, that this is not the first time this has happened. In the late 60s, it happened, right? Most major institutions in the late 60s either had direct protests to them or were responding to the environment in the country and in their cities and created all sorts of outreach, career development programs, audience development programs. A lot of the language that we use came out of that moment. But many of those programs did not last, right? They fell apart sort of based on the notion that they went against ideas of institutional excellence or institutional direction. And what I think we have now is a moment where we're saying, this is not a zero-sum game. We really are committed to this idea that our institutions absolutely need to change for not only their sustainability, but for their actual excellence in themselves.
So we've finally gotten beyond tokenism to a notion that diversity is excellence.
Look, I often have said I've been the diversity initiative in the museum world in this country for a long time. So I'm not quite sure we can say we are beyond it completely yet. I think what we can all say is we are ready, right,
Right.
for there to be. Everyone asks me, what is my commitment to creating curators and mentoring? I said, this is my retirement plan. The only way I'll ever get to stop working, right, is the possibility that there, are many, many, many more. And I say that jokingly, but I also say that because, I think of, the time that I had in this field early in my career. I never would have imagined that we'd be here 20 years later and still be talking about, the field not having the kind of richness and depth that I think we all imagine it has to have.
Teresita?
I think that, I agree with what everyone's saying. I think the pipeline issues are huge. We know that most Americans under 18 right now are Latinos. I want to just, instead of talking about what the solutions are, because I think that there have to be many solutions at once. I don't believe in this sort of bottom up, top. I think it has to be like bottom up, top down, and from all sides. And I think that it's going to require a kind of real commitment from people who are not people of color. Like, people of color have been doing this forever, right? But a kind of shared interest in why it's a good thing. I would point out just one more thing, that oftentimes where we see these diversity initiatives playing out in museums is always in the least powerful sector of the museum, right? Which is education. It's sort of this idea of let's do this program for the children. Let's bus in poor children from across town, and that makes everybody feel good. Okay. I often get called to speak to some of these children, right? And when you are looking at it either through a studio at a school or Cool Culture, which is an amazing organization in New York, as you know, that provides access to museums to thousands of disenfranchised family, mostly African American and Latino in New York City. What happens when you're in a room with 40 African American and Latino kids, and they tell you, we want a Latina to talk to them. These are all Latino kids. We want them to see that, you can imagine being an artist. Can you walk them through this museum and show them the art? And I'll say, I can't, because everything I point to looks nothing like them or their experience. And this is something that I experience even where I am at in my career, is that the way that museum collections are made and the way that acquisitions come into museums is very much based on the taste and the market and the consensus making, which is excluding all of the things that we're talking about, right? And so there's an invisibility of people of color within the museum itself. If you bring a group of Latino kids to get culture, to sort of have this seminal experience at a museum, and they look around and what they see is that culture means, being an artist means, people that don't have experiences like you. It means artists who don't look like you. It means artists who don't have names like you. What it means is that you do not see yourself, and you can be taken around as a guest as much as you want, but you simply do not connect with any of the things that are there in a personal way, right? And so that, I think, is really problematic, right? Because the programming is key. Like, the easiest way to do, everybody sort of sits there and scratches their head and thinks, oh, we need to do community outreach. How do we get these people in here? And it's usually a not very diverse group of people trying to scratch their heads and think of how you can get the community in here. The easiest way to get the community, many communities, right? Because there are many communities, there is to find an example of someone who represents who they are in some way, in an excellent way, that promotes pride, that you go in and you see everybody looking at this exhibition, not just the disenfranchised people, not just the African American kids looking at African American art or the Latino kids. looking at Latino art. And by the way, we haven't mentioned Asian Americans, but Asian Americans are the second largest demographic and also the biggest group of immigrants right now. The growing group of immigrants is Asian American, not Latino. So it's important to not leave that out too, because often we talk about ancient Asian art, just like Latin America, but we don't talk about contemporary Asian American artists, just like Latinos. So I would just say that what you're seeing when you get brought to that museum for that seminal museum experience that everybody imagines will change your life matters. You know, it matters if you're looking at things that feel foreign to you and stories and narratives that are not what you know.
So you mentioned outreach, and Thelma, you and I have discussed a little bit. There's sort of an upstairs-downstairs problem. The museums are not completely devoid of diversity, but it tends to be clustered in security and maintenance jobs. It's interesting that the myth in commercial entertainment and in many areas of finance is you work your way up from the mailroom. We have yet to have someone in a museum work their way up from the mailroom. What are the potential opportunities of starting to cultivate the folks downstairs and figuring out whether there's an extant group of talent within these institutions?
One of, through my life, I grew up in New York City, very lucky to have access to all the museums in New York City in my youth. And one of the things that was always interesting to me as a 13, 14, 15-year-old walking through the great museums of New York, the Whitney, the Met, MoMA, the Guggenheim, is always there were guards, mostly middle-aged African-American men who'd see me wandering on my own, who would talk to me, right? Who would ask me why I was there, who talked to me about art. Quite amazingly, some of those guards still exist in institutions in New York City, right? And have watched my career trajectory. What has been interesting to me is that the outreach principle in most museums has been made a function of a kind of staff that sits in education. Whereas my own experience going into museums, my own, others in New York City with this incredible group of security and maintenance workers, mostly Black and Latino, is how deeply invested they are in the institutions they work in. How deeply they think about what their institution is, and how they actually potentially form the best outreach corps that any institution can have. But they are not empowered, right, to talk about art and program. That's the province, of course, of education, of curators. But in many cases, I look at institutions that are spending millions of dollars on outreach, in my context, New York City, to go out into the boroughs, the very places where all this staff, security and maintenance, live, where their kids go to school, where they go to church or worship. And that, in many ways, some of this really is about how we begin to think about our staffs in this diversity principle and really empower. Right? And really empower in different ways. So it's one of the things that I think that in the near term becomes a very interesting principle to sort of think about. I have the experience all the time when I visit museums that are not my own, and it's a day that's closed and I'm going to see a staff person. And usually, again, the guard, Black or Latino, will sort of ask me why I'm there, and I'll say I'm going to visit so-and-so, and they'll say why, and I'll say I'm a curator or I'm a director. I usually say curator, I don't really say director very often in public. But I, will say I'll say I'm a curator, and they will just, fill with so much sort of wonder, and pride, but then also real questions about that, and they'll say, I've never met a curator, of color. And it's just amazing to me because on the other hand, if I begin to ask them, who's been coming to this exhibition? Or, what's this work about? They will say to me astute things that sometimes even us, those of us as curators don't. They'll say, what? The labels in this room are in the wrong place. Nobody can tell which one is that. No, literally, they really have, they'll talk to me about this issue of young people. And then finally, the thing that, I find most profound that happens to me all the time, it recently happened to me in Michael's museum, is when a guard of color will come up to me and point out the work of an artist of color. Because they don't want me to leave the institution without having the experience. They have no idea who I am. They'll see me in the gallery and they'll say to me, that is, and they want me to know that. And so I just think that, when we saw those statistics, right, 83%, most of these staffs, are white, but the majority of the people of color in institutions have these roles where they're not empowered as part of the institution to help us with this work, to help us speak to those audiences everyone's trying to reach. I think that's where we make an immediate change that could have profound effect on even how these many communities understand what the museum itself is.
Michael?
It does work. It's really easy, actually. We even have some of our guards writing for our blog with curators and with other people, and they turn out to be some of the most interesting
That's right.
written pieces because they come from a different perspective. It seems really obvious, so that's true. And I think, listen, the language of museums now is really good in this topic, like the language here in Aspen at the end. It's all very good language, but the question is, what are the results? And when you really look at it, there are still, and I'm the eternal optimist, there are still fundamental issues about infrastructure and images, because most museums, big museums, literally everything about them, the architecture, the Greco-Roman temple facade, the way everything is organized. It's Greece and Rome and Europe. And so you have programs for outreach, and you can make all those programs. But fundamentally, when a child walks into one of those spaces, and it's very powerful, art and architecture, their worldview is structured by this 19th century point of view. There's nothing wrong with it. The Aspen Ideas Festival is built upon some of that philosophy. However, the new world, if you're going to reach out, has to have a completely different image. And I'm one of those people who often thinks, and I'm saying this with all due care, that we ought to tear down a lot of that and rebuild it. We're literally doing that in LA, is tearing down the museum. And the whole idea of tearing down the museum is to create a different physical structure, one that has a lot of glass, so you can walk through the park and look inside the museum. One that is non-hierarchical. There's no front door. There's different entrances, so therefore no cultures in the front, but more importantly, no cultures in the back. Like, these are fundamental things about the way you structure visitor experience that don't send these other very heavy biases that no amount of little outreach program is going to really counter in that sense. So I really do think it is a moment for a certain reflection, as you're saying, a reassessment, and maybe some fundamental changes in the whole infrastructure of our institutions, not to be lesser or to give things up, but actually to gain, to just absorb the potential of new audiences. And by the way, to stay alive, because I mean, we have a lot of arrogance about our sustainability, and if you had asked newspapers 15 years ago, would they ever go away? And they would say, are you kidding? The bastion of civic life and information, that's impossible, it'll never happen. Of course, look where we are today. And I often warn institutions and museums and things like that we should, be wary of that there may be worlds that don't need us in an age of media, decentered distribution of culture. One of the surveys by a marketing company that looked into with Getty, the Getty Foundation for PST, the PST1, why don't some young people and people of color going to museums, is it because they don't like culture? No, it's because, we love culture, we just don't always find it in the museum. Right? So those are very fundamental ideas, and no amount of small outreach programs, if you don't sort of think about the infrastructure itself and how it might have to be kind of really cracked open and reconsidered. And I think that's our mission.
That notion that culture is here and that some people don't want it or don't have access to it is completely naive.
Yes.
People who don't have access to museums have their own culture,
Yes.
have very, very rich traditions and cultures that are healthy and intact, and that other people can learn from as well. And I go back to this reciprocity, which I think is essential. It isn't just that they have something to learn from coming to museums and cultural institutions. It's that the people running and making decisions in cultural institutions have something to learn from them as well. And that sort of shared culture is like, I always go back to that because I think that it is the only thing that makes a viable solution.
And the institution has to change its identity, because it's like we don't do a lot of Latino programming and Hispanic programming just because that's what we assume that audience wants. We assume that audience wants to feel comfortable that our whole identity is invested in a diverse identity, and they're just as, that audience is going to see Impressionism just like everybody else. There's no, it's a question of the identity of the place, and that it feels like a place that's built upon a different, more diverse set of foundations.
Yeah.
Do we have time for some questions? I think the protocol is to come up to the microphone here, if maybe a couple people at a time, just so we can keep the pipeline, as it were, going. Yes, sir.
My name is Nathan Schmalo. Hi, thank you. My question relates to curators. Is it really necessary that curators have a PhD in art history? And is there a role for what I'll call guest curators, the Terestas of the world, people with a special eye? And have there been thoughts about that?
So Thelma and Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, we're talking about a lot of different kinds of museums, and I think that what we all want in our museums, in our curators, is a deep level of rigor and expertise. And often in many fields, that requires a PhD. Not simply as a credential, but because it represents the weight of a kind of scholarship around the work itself. Is it completely necessary? No. I think most of us want to have diverse curatorial staffs from different perspectives. So there are many artists, for example, who curate, and that can be a way into the curatorial realm. I think in terms of guest curators, that has been primarily the strategy as a way to engage diversity. And it is effective. It does bring more voices to the table, but it doesn't create fundamental change. So that, from my perspective, if we really want to create fundamental change, we are really talking about changing the structures that allow for more people in the positions where they are not just working on exhibition, but collection, and are fundamentally a part of the museum environment in ways that impacts how we understand diversity as something that's integrated, not brought in as an initiative or an idea, and then goes away.
One implication of that answer is, of course, the work that may need to be done in the pipeline of art historical training, and what are some of the reasons why that isn't as welcoming as it might be. But Michael?
I mean, and like in any university, the ratio of non-PhDs will not, you do need people who have shown that commitment of study. But by the way, don't discount the radical reinvention of the place through the PhDs, because there are other politics that play out. Like most of contemporary art practice now, you don't need a PhD because it's considered, almost not in vogue if you don't have that real-world experience. Meanwhile, I have PhDs who speak other languages. For example, my curator of art of the Middle East, who's proposing contemporary art from the Middle East with a PhD that the non-PhDs are saying, well, we're not sure that's good art. And then I'm thinking, well, she has eons of experience and knows centuries of art history, and so she has become the radical in diversifying the collections of contemporary art. So I know there's a little bias against PhDs now, but I also find that some of those people who know other cultures deeply are a means to diversify the contemporary practice.
Isn't Glenn Lowry's PhD is in Islamic art?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
My name is Barbara Lane. I'm from San Francisco, where we finally have our new MoMA, thank goodness. But I want to ask a question that's a little off topic, but I've watched with dismay as one of our major museums does show after show based on the work of major fashion designers. And there's a lot of conversation around this. These shows are incredibly popular. The attendance is through the roof, yet I've had a lot of dinner table conversations arguing that this should not be the role of our museums. And we're not alone, of course. They do it in New York as well. But it's a reason why they don't do other things. So I guess I'd like to ask you to comment on that and how you get away from that, even though it brings in audience, it brings in money, it brings in, when I went to see the Oscar de la Renta, begrudgingly, there was very multiracial audience there, videos of Taylor Swift in these gowns. It's just depressing to me, so if you could comment.
Michael, as a guy who's just launched a fashion exhibition,
We have
do you
a
want to
great
take that
fashion
question?
show up right now. I would encourage you to see it. It's about the history of men's fashion, which has never been done before. And it's a very scholarly presentation. And I would just say, like anything, so fashion is an art, and it is an art that can radically reinvent our social and political practice, as can any other creative practice. So I would never want to discount that. I think of it as one of the agents of change in our world. The question is, as always, how do you do it? because you can do an exhibition of Impressionist art which questions its relationship to other things going on at the time, to the exotic, to Orientalism, to other ways of thinking about late 19th century culture, or you can just show a lot of pretty paintings and, say it's Monet and you want to see a pretty colorful painting. So it's a question of how you do it. And I think one of the things we've wanted to do is not discount any medium in our contemporary society. And I will mention Thelma's husband has a fantastic show of his fashion in London right now, which is really also revolutionary and shows different ways of thinking and channels cultural practices that are not generally accepted in our mainstream as a way to reconsider them. So what you're seeing and what you're reacting to, I don't think is the content. You're reacting to, or the medium, it's reacting to the kind of easy way of presentation.
Right.
Right. Should
And
be
I think
diverse.
you're also responding to what is sort of a bigger question, and that is the issue of audience generally. I think, and when museums begin to acknowledge what the perception of what audiences might want, that's perhaps when you get a kind of steady stream of a certain kind of exhibition which prove themselves, as opposed to the work that sometimes goes into creating audiences, right? Through creating complex presentations that then open up spaces that might not be in museums, like fashion, but open them up in different ways.
Since we're almost out of time, I'd just like to, both of you are wanting to ask questions, if you could just both ask them, and then we'll answer them in combo.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could talk about the role of technology and maybe how philanthropists could help. I love at MoMA how Bloomberg has made the acoustic guides, adults and kids, and really diverse curatorial voices on the acoustic guides. Photography is much more encouraged. What else would you like to see happen?
You addressed to some degree the role of the market here and the museum in a very complicated, interconnected ecology. But in terms of just looking at some of the more, especially in recent decades, the role of the market and imbalances to the degree that there can be, museums can be priced out of the market in purchasing art, or the proliferation of private museums and so forth. I mean, some of these trends and what kinds of dialogues can begin really with the core stakeholders primarily, such as the boards and the people who really are invested at that level. But when it's really when the concern about market-driven forces possibly overwhelming.
Well, I think Michael said it before, but in some ways museums can exist not in concert with the market. At the Studio Museum, this is a particularly complex issue because as our role in our founding was about advocating for Black artists, one of the places in which our advocacy became important was the market. That is, in the 60s, Black artists weren't in the market at all, right? And so what our work has done is put many artists in the market. And that is not our goal. Our goal is to put artists into the world, to give them the kinds of exhibitions so that names like Kehinde Wiley or Wangechi Mutu or Mark Bradford can be out in the world showing their work, but of course that intersects with the market. And so what I think institutions can do is to remain mission focused. Our mission remains the same, but also to sort of galvanize those forces that allow then for more support for this work to continue. Right? And that's perhaps the place at which coming together on an idea of what it means to be in support of artists, to create new pathways, to open up art histories, means you can't do that in a bubble. I'd be naive to think that. But also understand it's part of this larger ecology that in my own desire and in my institutional mission, we see as a part of the way in which we are impacting the history and the trajectory of these artists.
Teresita, do you want to comment on the technology question from the point of view of an artist? Yeah. Is that your friend, your enemy? You certainly use it in making your work.
I do, but I have a sort of high-tech, low-tech approach to it, where I see the technology as a tool for intimacy. I mean, my ultimate goal, like the effect I value the most in an art experience, is intimacy. I think that I don't get too involved in technology and in how museums use technology, so maybe I'm not the right person to answer this, but I do think that there needs to somehow be a way of not divorcing the intimate experience that is so sort of unique in art, and really kind of very singular. It's one of the few places where we have intimacy left, you know, and it's scarce, and it's a sort of precious thing, I think. So I think that when technology can be used to emphasize that through knowledge, through accessibility, et cetera, that's all good. But it certainly doesn't replace the actual experience.
I can tell you just the Bloomberg Philanthropies programs we do fund in technology are all about trying to create that sense of intimacy and the repersonalizing the experience. I think we are out of time now. I am hopeful that some of us can linger because I know that there were some unanswered questions. Happy to have those conversations. And again, thanks to our wonderful panelists.